The manila envelope slid across my birthday cake, smearing frosting onto the crisp legal papers inside. "Happy 70th, Mom," Victor said, his voice as cold as the untouched ice cream melting beside my plate. "You've been declared mentally incompetent. I'm taking control of your assets, for your own good." His wife Denise stood behind him, nodding with practiced concern, but I just smiled. 3 months earlier, I had quietly transferred everything I owned into an irrevocable trust, naming myself as the sole beneficiary. My son thought he was claiming his inheritance early, but he was reaching for a mirage that had already disappeared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I live in a modest 2-story colonial in Maple Ridge, a sleepy suburb of Burlington, Vermont, where the winters are as harsh as they are beautiful. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and for the past 45 years, I taught English literature at Burlington Community College. I raised Victor alone after my husband David died of a heart attack when our son was just 7 years old. Teaching never made me wealthy, but careful saving and David's life insurance policy had allowed me to put away a respectable nest egg. I owned my home outright, maintained a healthy retirement account, and had even purchased a small lakeside cabin that had been in David's family for generations. I'd spent decades meticulously building security for myself and for Victor. When Victor married Denise 12 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. They lived in Boston, a 4-hour drive away, building careers in corporate finance that made my teacher's pension look like pocket change. I saw them 3 or 4 times a year, always on my dime, always with me making the trip down to Boston since they were just too busy to come north. 6 months ago, that changed. Victor called on a Tuesday evening, his voice uncharacteristically warm. "Mom, we've been thinking about you all alone up there. We're going to move back to Vermont to be closer to you." I nearly dropped the phone. After years of holidays spent alone, years of Victor having urgent work calls halfway through our brief visits, this sudden concern caught me off guard. Still, I was overjoyed. Perhaps he'd finally realized what mattered most. Within weeks, they'd sold their Boston condo and purchased a sprawling house just 20 minutes from mine. Victor quit his job, explaining that he wanted to try something new up here. Denise scaled back to part-time remote work. I was ecstatic, if confused by the abruptness of it all. The first few weeks were everything I'd dreamed. Victor visited almost daily, fixing things around the house I'd let slip, the squeaky porch step, the dripping bathroom faucet. Denise brought grocery deliveries and fresh-baked bread. They invited me to dinner twice a week. I felt, for the first time in years, like I was part of a family again. Then came the gentle suggestions. "Mom, the cabin's sitting empty most of the year. Have you thought about selling it? Property values at the lake have skyrocketed. Or, have you considered downsizing? This house is awfully big for just one person." Each comment was wrapped in concern, each suggestion framed as looking out for my best interests. I deflected these comments gently. The cabin had been David's pride and joy. I couldn't bear to part with it. And this house held 40 years of memories. Every corner whispered stories of the life we'd built. The suggestions soon became more persistent. "Mom, I've been looking at your investment portfolio. It's far too conservative. Let me manage it for you. I could increase your returns by 30%. I smiled and thanked him, but explained I was comfortable with my financial advisor, a woman I'd worked with for 15 years. That's when I began noticing small things. My medication sorted differently in the pill organizer, papers on my desk rearranged, the frequent comments about my forgetfulness when I was certain I'd remembered correctly. "Mom, we agreed I would drive you to Dr. Miller on Thursday, remember? You've been so absent-minded lately." But I hadn't forgotten. I'd never agreed to that appointment. One evening, I overheard Victor on the phone in my garden, speaking in hushed tones. "The lake property alone is worth over $500,000. The house may be another 400,000. Retirement accounts probably another 6 or 700,000. Once we establish guardianship, we can relocate her to Sunny Pines. The untouched monthly fee is reasonable and we can liquidate the properties. I stood frozen among my hydrangeas, heart pounding in my chest. Sunny Pines was an assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. Not a bad place, but certainly not where I intended to live out my days. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying moments from the past months in my mind, reinterpreting each helpful gesture through this new lens. The next morning, I called my old friend Eleanor, who had practiced family law for 4 decades before retiring. "They're building a case for guardianship," she confirmed after I explained the situation. The sudden move back, the comments about your memory, the gradual insertion into your financial affairs. It's textbook, Margaret. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Protect yourself," she said simply. "And I know exactly who can help." 2 days later, I sat in the office of Patricia Chen, an estate attorney Eleanor had recommended. I brought my financial statements, property, deeds, and medical records showing my recent physical and cognitive assessments, all perfect for a woman of my age. "Your son is preparing to declare you incompetent," Patricia explained, confirming my fears. "Once he establishes guardianship, he'll have control over your assets, your living situation, even your medical decisions." "Can he do that? I'm perfectly competent." I gestured to the medical evaluations. Patricia smiled grimly. "With enough documentation of concerning behavior and the right doctor's evaluation, yes. These cases often favor the child, especially when they frame it as concern rather than greed." "Then what can I do?" "We create an irrevocable trust," she said, sliding a diagram across her desk. "Transfer your assets into it. Name yourself as beneficiary with a trusted friend as successor trustee, not your son. Once assets are in an irrevocable trust, they're no longer legally yours to be taken. You'll maintain full use and benefit during your lifetime, but they can't be touched by guardianship proceedings." I left Patricia's office with a plan. Over the next month, I quietly transferred my home, the cabin, my investments, and my bank accounts into the Margaret Sullivan Living Trust, with Eleanor as successor trustee. I updated my will, my advance directive, and my power of attorney, removing Victor from all documents. I installed cameras in my home. I kept a detailed journal of every interaction, every suggestion, every rearranged object. And I waited, smiling through dinners where they discussed how confused I seemed lately. I nodded when Victor offered to simplify my finances. I pretended not to notice when Denise took photos of my medication bottles. As my 70th birthday approached, Victor suggested a small celebration at my house. Just the 3 of us. "Mom, I'll bring a cake from that bakery you love." I knew then that something was coming. Victor hadn't remembered my birthday without a reminder in 20 years. He certainly didn't know which bakery I loved. And so here we were. My birthday cake defiled by legal papers, Victor's face confident, Denise's hand squeezing his shoulder in support. The documents declared me a danger to myself due to progressing dementia and requested emergency temporary guardianship. They had filed them yesterday. I dabbed frosting from my lips with a napkin and smiled. "That's interesting, Victor. Would you like some coffee with your cake? I think we have a lot to discuss." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victor's face remained frozen in that confident smile, but something flickered behind his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. He hadn't expected me to be so calm. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her chair as I stood to pour coffee into 3 ceramic mugs I'd made during a pottery class last summer. "Cream and sugar?" I asked pleasantly. "Mom, did you understand what I just said?" Victor's voice had an edge to it now. "These are legal documents. The court has appointed me as your emergency guardian. Your assets Would you like to see my most recent neurological assessment? I interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. Dr. Harriet Webster at Burlington Neurology conducted it just 3 weeks ago. Full cognitive panel. Perfect scores. Across the board. The color drained from Victor's face as he flipped through the medical report. Denise peered over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his shirt. This doesn't change anything, she said quickly. One good day with a doctor doesn't erase what we've seen. You left the stove on last month, Margaret. Did I? I raised an eyebrow. Or did someone turn it on after I'd already turned it off? I nodded toward the small camera tucked discreetly into the bookshelf beside my refrigerator. I've been documenting everything you see. Victor slammed the folder shut. Cameras? You've been spying on us? That just proves you're paranoid. Oh, I prefer cautious, I replied, taking a sip of coffee. Especially after I overheard your conversation in my garden about selling my properties and moving me to Sunny Pines. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You misunderstood. We were discussing options, long-term care planning. Without including me in the conversation, I asked, about my life and my assets. Denise tried a different approach, her voice suddenly gentle. Margaret, we're worried about you. Living alone at your age is risky. What if you fall? What if there's a fire? I nodded thoughtfully. Valid concerns. That's why I had a medical alert system installed last month, and smoke detectors with direct connection to the fire department. I lifted my sleeve to reveal the thin bracelet around my wrist. I've made sensible preparations for aging in place. Victor's frustration visibly mounted. He pulled another document from the envelope, this one thicker than the others. This is a signed statement from Dr. Lawrence. Grayson confirming early-stage dementia. He evaluated you last week. I frowned, genuinely confused. I've never met Dr. Grayson. Yes, you did, Denise insisted. Last Thursday, we took you to his office on Maple Street. That's when it clicked. Last Thursday, they'd taken me to what they called a wellness center for what they described as a routine physical. The doctor had asked me strange questions, seeming to note when I hesitated even slightly. The appointment where you told me I was getting a Medicare wellness check? Where the doctor never introduced himself properly or explained he was conducting a cognitive assessment. I shook my head. Obtaining a medical evaluation under false pretenses might interest the medical board. Victor's confidence was crumbling, visibly. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm calling our lawyer. This is ridiculous. While you do that, I said, retrieving my own folder from the sideboard, you might want to take a look at these. I spread several documents across the birthday cake remnants. This is the certification of the Margaret Sullivan Living Trust, dated 3 months ago. And these are the deeds showing transfer of both properties into the trust. And these are the statements confirming transfer of all financial assets. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Victor's breathing seemed to stop as he stared at the papers. What? He finally managed. I transferred everything I own into an irrevocable trust, I explained calmly. I'm the beneficiary during my lifetime. Eleanor Mackenzie is the successor trustee. You'll note your name doesn't appear anywhere. Denise's face contorted with rage. You can't do that. Those are our... She stopped herself, but too late. Our... What? I asked softly. Your properties? Your accounts? Strange. I don't recall your name on any deed or statement. Victor stood so abruptly his chair tipped backward, clattering against the hardwood floor. This isn't over. You clearly weren't of sound mind when you created this trust. We'll have it invalidated. Good luck with that, I replied. The trust creation was witnessed by 2 attorneys, a bank manager, and accompanied by a complete neurological workup confirming my competence. Oh, and there's video documentation of the entire process. I smiled thinly. I learned to be thorough from raising you, Victor. Remember how meticulous I was checking your homework? He grabbed the guardianship papers from the table, shoving them haphazardly back into the envelope. Frosting smeared across the manila surface, a fitting metaphor for the mess he'd made of his scheme. "We were trying to help you," Denise insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. "Were you? Then perhaps you can explain these." I slid my phone across the table, screen displaying a series of text messages between Victor and Denise from 2 months ago. "Once we get guardianship, we can sell the lake house first. The market's hot right now. Should clear enough to pay off our debts and have a decent cushion left over. What if she fights it? She won't even know what hit her. Dr. Grayson owes me from that investment advice last year. He'll write whatever evaluation we need." Victor's face went from pale to ashen. "You hacked our phones? That's illegal." "No, dear. You used my iPad to check your messages last month and never signed out. The synchronization did the rest." I took back my phone. Technology can be so confusing, can it? Perhaps you're the one needing cognitive assessment. Denise grabbed her purse. "We're leaving. Come on, Victor." He stood frozen, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Perhaps he hadn't. Not really. Not the woman who had managed to raise him single-handedly while earning 2 advanced degrees and teaching full-time. Not the woman who had navigated widowhood at 32 without faltering. Certainly not the woman who could see through his transparent plan and outmaneuver him at every turn. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a child. "Why would you go to all this trouble? If you had concerns, why not just talk to us?" The question hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the love I'd carried for him his entire life, that fierce protective instinct that had governed so many of my decisions. "I did try," I said quietly. 3 times I asked what was behind your sudden interest in my finances. 3 times you deflected. I raised you to be direct, Victor, not to manipulate an old woman for her money." Denise tugged at his arm. "We don't have to listen to this." As they moved toward the door, I called after them. "I've scheduled a meeting with Patricia Chen, my attorney, for tomorrow morning at 10. If you'd like to discuss a path forward, one that doesn't involve deception or court orders, I'll be there. Your presence is optional." The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the photographs on my wall. Pictures of a younger Victor graduating college, starting his first job, marrying Denise. Moments I'd treasured that now felt like scenes from a stranger's life. I sat alone at my birthday table, surrounded by legal papers, cake crumbs, and the wreckage of what I'd thought was a reconciliation with my son. The silence of the house pressed in around me, heavier than it had ever been before. For the first time since David died, I allowed myself to cry without restraint. The sun had barely crested over the mountains when I awoke the next morning, my eyes swollen from crying. I hadn't set an alarm, but decades of teaching had programmed an internal clock that rarely failed. For a brief, merciful moment, I forgot the events of the previous day. Then reality crashed back, heavy and cold. My son had tried to take everything from me. The realization sat like lead in my stomach as I moved through my morning routine. Brewing coffee, toasting bread, opening curtains to let in the pale Vermont light. Simple actions that felt suddenly foreign, as if I were moving through someone else's life. I checked my phone. No messages from Victor, no apology, no explanation. Just silence, which somehow hurt more than anger would have. At 9:15, I drove to Patricia Chen's office for our scheduled meeting. I'd been hoping, despite everything, that perhaps Victor would show up. But as I sat in the elegant conference room, with its polished mahogany table and landscape paintings, the empty chairs across from me confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't coming. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Patricia said, entering with a leather portfolio and a sympathetic smile. "I'd hoped your son might reconsider." "So had I admitted, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my skirt. "But I'm not surprised," Patricia arranged her papers meticulously. I've reviewed everything. The trust is solid. There's virtually no chance of Victor successfully challenging it, given the documentation of your competence and the proper legal procedures we followed. That's something, at least. But, she continued, her expression turning serious, we need to discuss next steps. What Victor and his wife attempted constitutes elder abuse under Vermont law. Their fraudulent medical evaluation, documented attempts to seize your assets, these are criminal matters. I stared out the window at the maple trees lining the street, their leaves beginning to hint at autumn. You want me to press charges against my own son? It wasn't a question, but Patricia nodded anyway. I think you should consider it. At minimum, we should file for a restraining order. What's to stop them from trying again with a different strategy? Her words landed like stones disturbing still water, sending ripples of realization through me. She was right. Yesterday hadn't been the end, it had been the beginning. Victor had shown me exactly who he had become. A man willing to institutionalize his mother for financial gain. A man who saw my life's work as his inheritance rather than my security. A man who had, somewhere along the way, lost the values I thought I'd instilled in him. I need time to think, I said finally. Of course. Patricia closed her portfolio. But don't take too long. People like this tend to escalate when their initial plans fail. I drove home slowly, my thoughts churning. The familiar streets of Maple Ridge seemed different somehow, less welcoming, more threatening. I found myself scanning for Victor's silver Audi at each intersection, tension building in my shoulders whenever a similar vehicle appeared. Was this my life now? Looking over my shoulder, afraid of my own child. At home, I double-checked the locks, then stood in my living room, suddenly seeing it through new eyes. The antique secretary desk that had been David's grandfather's. The Persian rug we'd splurged on for our 20th anniversary. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions I'd collected throughout my teaching career. Each item had a story, a memory, a purpose, and each item was something Victor and Denise had planned to sell off while I languished in Sunny Pines. I moved to my study and opened my laptop. With a determination that surprised me, I began to research. First, elder abuse, statistics, warning signs, legal protections. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of cases annually, most perpetrated by family members. Most victims never reported the abuse out of shame or fear. Next, I researched my options: restraining orders, adult protective services, pressing criminal charges. Each path seemed more drastic than the last, yet increasingly necessary. Finally, I looked into something I'd never considered before: severing ties completely, legally disowning an adult child, removing them from wills, from medical directives, from every aspect of one's life. It was possible, but the finality of it made my hands shake as I closed the laptop. The afternoon mail arrived with a soft thud through the slot. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a thick cream envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. Inside was a card from Eleanor, my friend and now successor trustee. Margaret, Patricia told me what happened. My door is open anytime you need to talk. Remember, protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. You taught generations of students to value their worth. Time to take your own lesson to heart. With love and solidarity, Eleanor. I traced my fingers over her handwriting, tears threatening again. Eleanor had been widowed young too, had raised her daughter alone, had built a successful legal career despite the odds. She understood, in a way few could, what it meant to have your strength turned against you by someone you loved. The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw Denise standing on my porch, arms crossed impatiently. My heart raced as I considered ignoring her. But no, I wouldn't hide in my own home. I opened the door but kept the security chain latched. Yes? We need to talk, she said, her tone clipped. About yesterday. Things got out of hand. Did they? I replied. Or did things go exactly according to plan until you discovered I'd protected myself? Her perfectly composed expression faltered, for just a moment. Victor's upset. He feels betrayed. I almost laughed at the audacity. He feels betrayed? After attempting to have me declared incompetent? After planning to sell my home and properties? You're twisting everything, she insisted. We were trying to simplify your affairs, make sure you were taken care of. By moving me to Sunny Pines against my will? By obtaining fraudulent medical evaluations? Denise's face hardened. We're prepared to forget about all of that if you'll just be reasonable about the trust. Victor is your only child. Those assets should rightfully pass to him eventually. All we're asking is for some access now when we need it. His business venture requires capital. And there it was, the truth, finally. This wasn't about my well-being. It was about money for Victor's latest scheme. The answer is no, I said firmly. And unless you're here to apologize sincerely for your actions, we have nothing more to discuss. She leaned closer to the chain-latched gap. Think very carefully, Margaret. Victor is devastated. Your stubbornness is destroying your relationship with your only family. In that moment, something crystallized within me. A certainty I hadn't felt since deciding to raise Victor alone after David's death. No, Denise. Your and Victor's greed destroyed that relationship. I'm simply acknowledging what's already happened. Closed the door on her protests, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. As her footsteps retreated down my porch steps, I reached for my phone and dialed Patricia's number. I've made my decision, I said when she answered. I want to file for that restraining order, and I want to know all my options for permanently protecting myself, legally, financially, and physically. I'll prepare everything, Patricia replied. And Margaret? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. As I hung up, I noticed my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me looked different, older in some ways, but also stronger, clearer-eyed, more resolved. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for my 70s. This wasn't the relationship I had worked so hard to build with my son. But acknowledging that truth, painful as it was, felt like the first step toward whatever came next. Patricia's office had become something of a war room over the following week. Today, we sat surrounded by stacks of documents, legal pads filled, with notes and 2 tablets displaying calendar appointments. Eleanor joined us, her decades of family law experience proving invaluable as we crafted what Patricia had dubbed the Independence Plan. The temporary restraining order has been granted, Patricia announced, sliding a document across the table. Victor and Denise cannot come within 500 feet of your home, your vehicle, or your person for the next 30 days. We'll have a hearing. For a permanent order before that expires. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and heartache. Legal protection from my own child. A concept that still felt surreal. Now, Eleanor continued, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad. Let's discuss your daily security. The trust protects your assets, and the restraining order provides legal distance, but we need to ensure your physical safety and peace of mind. I've already changed the locks and security codes, I said, and I've installed additional cameras, covering all entry points. Patricia nodded approvingly. Good start. I've also arranged for a security consultant to visit tomorrow. He specializes in helping older adults secure their homes against various threats. Various threats, I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. You make it sound like I'm preparing for a siege. Not a siege, Eleanor said gently. Just ensuring that you can live comfortably without looking over your shoulder. Remember what Victor and Denise attempted. They were willing to have you institutionalized. That level of determination rarely disappears after one setback. She was right, of course. The seriousness of what they'd planned still hadn't fully registered. They hadn't just wanted my money. They'd been willing to strip me of my autonomy entirely. "I've prepared a document revoking all previous powers of attorney," Patricia continued, sliding another paper toward me. "This new one names Eleanor as your healthcare proxy and grants her limited financial power of attorney to be used only if you're genuinely incapacitated." I signed where indicated, my signature stronger than I felt. "What about my will?" "We'll rewrite it completely," Patricia confirmed. "Since Victor is your only child, we'll need to be thorough in documenting your wishes and mental competence to withstand any potential challenges." Eleanor cleared her throat. "Have you thought about who you'd like to name as beneficiaries instead?" The question hung in the air. Who would receive what I'd spent a lifetime building? With no other family to speak of, the answer wasn't obvious. "I've been thinking about establishing a scholarship fund at Burlington Community College," I said. Finally. "For single parents pursuing teaching degrees," Patricia smiled. "That's a wonderful idea. We can set that up as your primary beneficiary. And I'd like to leave the cabin to the Vermont Land Conservation Trust," I added, "with the stipulation that it be used for environmental education programs. David would have liked that." As we continued mapping out my revised estate plan, a strange sense of liberation began to grow within me. Each decision, each signature was an act of reclaiming my life and legacy. For decades, I'd operated under the assumption that everything I built would naturally flow to Victor. Now, freed from that expectation, I could align my legacy with my actual values. "There's another matter we should discuss," Eleanor said, her tone turning more serious. "The elephant in the room, the question of reconciliation." I stiffened slightly. "What about it?" "We need a protocol," she explained. "If Victor or Denise attempt to contact you offering apologies or reconciliation, how do you want to handle it?" The question cut straight to my heart. Despite everything, part of me still loved my son. Still remembered the little boy who'd crawl into my lap after David died, asking when Daddy was coming home. The teenager who'd worked alongside me in the garden every spring. The young man who'd tearfully thanked me at his college graduation. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't trust myself to make that judgment in the moment." Patricia nodded understandingly. "Then we create a buffer. Any attempts at contact come through me first. I can screen for sincerity, look for hidden agendas, and no discussions about assets or finances," Eleanor added firmly. "Any genuine reconciliation would need to be about rebuilding trust, not money." We continued working until late afternoon, creating what Patricia called decision trees for various scenarios. What to do if Victor showed up at my door despite the restraining order. How to respond if he tried to contact my friends or colleagues. When to involve the police versus when to handle things through legal channels. By the time we finished, I felt simultaneously exhausted and fortified. Our plan wasn't just about protection, it was about reclaiming my narrative. "There's one more thing," Patricia said as we gathered our belongings. "I think you should consider a sabbatical of sorts, a few weeks away while we implement these changes. Somewhere Victor wouldn't think to look for you." "Running away doesn't seem like the right answer," I protested. "Not running away," Eleanor clarified. "Strategic regrouping. It's harder to intimidate or manipulate someone who isn't where you expect them to be." I considered this. My fall semester hadn't started yet. I'd been planning to teach one literature course at the college, mostly to keep my mind active. "I do have that conference in Edinburgh next month. I could extend the trip, maybe visit some of the literary sites I've always taught about but never seen." Patricia brightened. "That's perfect. 3 weeks abroad while we handle the court proceedings for the permanent restraining order. By the time you return, the new security systems will be installed, and the legal protections will be firmly in place." That evening, I sat in my garden as twilight settled over Maple Ridge. The daylilies were fading, their orange blooms closing with the approach of fall. I'd planted them with Victor when he was 10, teaching him about perennials and the patience. they required. They'll come back every year, I'd explained. Even when you think they're gone forever, they're just gathering strength underground. I'd believe the same about maternal love, that no matter what, it would endure, returning season after season without effort or cultivation. Now I understood that some relationships, like some gardens, required more active tending. Sometimes, they even required pruning, the painful but necessary removal of parts that threatened the whole. My phone chimed with a text from Eleanor. Security consultant confirmed for 10 a.m. tomorrow. I'll bring coffee and those scones you like from Harper's Bakery. I smiled, realizing that while one relationship in my life was fracturing, others were strengthening. I'd spent so many years defining myself primarily as Victor's mother that I'd sometimes forgotten I was many other things too: a scholar, a colleague, a friend, a community member. As darkness fell completely, I gathered my gardening tools and headed inside. Tomorrow would bring more decisions, more plans, more steps toward this unexpected new chapter of my life. But tonight, I allowed myself a small measure of peace, knowing that I wasn't facing it alone, and knowing too that I was far stronger than Victor had given me credit for. Edinburgh greeted me with misting rain and ancient stone, both somehow comforting in their permanence. The literary conference that had brought me here had ended 3 days ago, but I'd extended my stay as planned, settling into a small apartment in the old town with views of the castle. 6,000 miles from Vermont, from Victor, from the life I'd known for 7 decades. The distance felt necessary, like drawing back to see a painting more clearly. "You look contemplative today," observed Moira, the owner of the bookshop below my apartment. At 75, she was a few years my senior and had quickly become both guide and friend during my stay. "Just taking stock," I replied, accepting the cup of tea she offered. The tiny back room of her shop had become my morning ritual: tea and conversation before setting out to explore the city. "Any word from the legal front?" she asked. I'd shared the broad strokes of my situation during our long conversations, finding it easier somehow to confide in this straight-talking Scottish woman than many friends I'd known for decades. Patricia emailed this morning, the permanent restraining. "Order hearing is scheduled for next week. She'll represent me in my absence." Moira nodded approvingly. "And how are you feeling about it all now? Still second-guessing yourself?" I smiled at her perceptiveness. During my first days in Edinburgh, I'd been plagued with doubt, wondering if I'd overreacted. If perhaps Victor had simply been misguided rather than malicious. If I should have tried harder to understand his perspective before taking such dramatic legal action. Less so, I admitted. The distance helps. So does this. I gestured to the journal on the table between us. At Moira's suggestion, I'd begun keeping a detailed chronology of the past year. Every interaction with Victor and Denise, every helpful intervention, every comment about my memory or capabilities, every financial discussion. Laid out in black and white, the pattern was unmistakable. Systematic manipulation, culminating in the attempted guardianship. "Good," she said firmly. "Clarity is a gift, even when what you're seeing clearly isn't pleasant." Moira had introduced me to her weekly writing group, 5 women ranging from 60 to 85 who met in the bookshop after closing hours. Their warm welcome had been unexpected, as had been their insights. "You're not the first woman to have a child try to take control of her assets," Fiona, a retired solicitor, had told me during my first meeting with the group. "It's practically a cliché, though no less painful for being common." I keep wondering where I went wrong with him, I'd confessed. What I did to make him value money over my well-being. Judith, a former psychologist with a shock of white hair, had shaken her head firmly. "That's like wondering what the rabbit did to make the fox. Hunt it. Your son's actions aren't about your parenting. They're about his character and choices." The women had encouraged me to write not just the chronology, but also my feelings about each event. The confusion, the hurt, the anger, and eventually, the determination. The process had been surprisingly cathartic, helping me separate my love. For the son I remembered from my need to protect myself from the man he'd become. My phone chimed with an email notification. Eleanor, updating me on the security renovations to my home. The new system had been installed, cameras with motion detection, reinforced locks, even panic buttons in strategic locations throughout the house. The security consultant had also suggested replacing the back garden fence with something taller and less easily scaled. Eleanor had overseen it all, sending daily pictures of the progress. "Your fortress awaits," she'd written, attaching photos of my transformed home. It looked both familiar and strange, still my beloved Victorian with its wraparound porch and gabled windows, but now bristling with subtle but significant security upgrades. "Planning your return?" Moira asked, nodding toward my phone. "Next week," I confirmed, though part of me is tempted to stay longer. "Running away isn't your style," she observed shrewdly. "You're a confronter, not an avoider. I recognized it the moment you walked into my shop asking for Scottish feminist literature rather than the usual tourist maps." I laughed. "You had me, pegged from the beginning. When you've sold books as long as I have, you develop a sense for people." She refilled my teacup. "What will you do when you get back? Besides the legal battles, I mean." It was a question I'd been considering throughout my stay. Before Victor's guardianship attempt, my life had settled into comfortable routines, teaching one class per semester, book club meetings, volunteer work at the college library, quiet evenings at home. Now, those routines felt insufficient too, passive for the woman I was becoming. "I'm going to teach a new course," I said, the idea crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. "On elder narratives in literature, the stories of older women finding their voice and power. Mrs. Dalloway, The Stone Angel, Olive Kitteridge." Moira's eyes lit up. "Add Muriel Spark to your syllabus. Memento Mori is brilliant on aging and societal attitudes toward it. I'll order it today," I promised. "And I'm considering volunteering with a legal aid organization in Burlington. They help seniors with estate planning and financial protection. My experience might be useful to others." "Turning wounds into wisdom," Moira nodded approvingly. "The best kind of alchemy." Later that afternoon, I climbed the steep steps to Edinburgh Castle, pushing myself despite the drizzle and the ache in my knees. At the top, wind whipping my hair around my face, I looked out over the ancient city with its layers of history visible in stone and street. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an email notification from Patricia. The subject line read simply, "Victor. Attempted contact." I hesitated before opening it, my heart suddenly racing. According to our protocol, Victor was to communicate only through Patricia during the restraining order period. Any direct contact would be a violation. The email was brief and professional. Victor had appeared at Patricia's office, requesting to speak with her about making things right with me. He'd seemed agitated, insisting that I was being influenced by outsiders who didn't understand our family. Patricia had reminded him of the restraining order and suggested he consult his own attorney. He'd left without incident, but had called twice since. My hands trembled slightly as I tucked the phone away. 6,000 miles between us, and still, the pull of our relationship, the hope, the hurt, the complexity of it, affected me physically. I took a deep breath of the crisp Scottish air and turned my face into the wind. 3 weeks ago, that email would have sent me into a spiral of doubt and longing. Now I recognized it for what it was, not a genuine attempt at reconciliation, but another effort to regain control. His concern was about outsiders influencing me, not about the harm he'd caused or the trust he'd broken. Back at my apartment that evening, I opened my journal and recorded both the incident and my response to it. Then I turned to a fresh page and began drafting the syllabus for my new course. Literature of Resilience and Renewal, I decided to call it. A study of characters who, like me, found themselves at unexpected crossroads in the later chapters of their lives. As I worked, a sense of purpose settled over me, stronger than the doubt, more enduring than the hurt. I was creating something new from the broken pieces of what had been, not just protecting myself, but growing beyond the boundaries I'd accepted for so long. The Vermont autumn had turned the mountains into a tapestry of crimson and gold by the time my plane touched down in Burlington. After 3 weeks abroad, the familiar landscape both welcomed and unsettled me. Home, but forever changed by what had transpired within it. Eleanor waited at the arrival gate, her tall figure easy to spot among the crowd. We embraced warmly, and I was surprised by the tears that sprang to my eyes. "Welcome home, warrior," she said, linking her arm through mine as we headed toward baggage claim. "How was the flight?" "Long," I admitted. "But it gave me time to prepare, mentally." She nodded, understanding what I didn't say explicitly, that returning meant facing the reality of my estrangement from Victor in a way that Edinburgh's distance had softened. "Patricia sends her regrets that she couldn't meet you," Eleanor said as we collected my luggage. The restraining order hearing ran longer than expected. My stomach tightened. "Any issues?" "Quite the contrary," Eleanor replied, guiding me toward the parking garage. The judge granted the permanent order without hesitation. Victor's lawyer tried to argue that the whole situation was a misunderstanding, but Patricia presented the text messages and the fraudulent medical evaluation. The judge was, let's just say, unimpressed with Victor's tactics. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by a familiar ache. My son was now legally prohibited from coming near me, a necessary protection that still felt like a profound failure. "Victor was there?" I asked as we reached Eleanor's car. "Yes," she said carefully, stowing my bags in the trunk. "He brought character witnesses, friends from his finance days who testified about what a devoted son he'd always been. Patricia countered with statements from your doctor and colleagues at the college. Facts prevailed over fiction." The drive to Maple Ridge took us through winding country roads, the late afternoon sun filtering through trees half bare of their leaves. Eleanor filled me in on college gossip and community news, tactfully avoiding further mention of the hearing, or Victor until I was ready. "Your home security is completely updated," she said as we turned onto my street. "The security consultant gave us his personal cell number in case you have any questions about the system." My house came into view, looking both familiar and strange. The new privacy fence encircled the back garden completely, and subtle camera installations were visible at the corners of the property. My sanctuary had become a fortress. "It's still your home," Eleanor said gently, noting my expression. "Just safer now." Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow transformed by my new perspective. The antique furniture and cherished books that Victor had planned to liquidate. The kitchen where I'd caught him secretly photographing my medication. Bottles. The dining room where he'd presented me with guardianship papers on my birthday. "I've stocked your refrigerator and picked up your mail," Eleanor said, setting my bags at the foot of the stairs. "Patricia left a folder of documents on your desk. Copies of the restraining order and instructions on what to do if Victor violates it." "Thank you." I squeezed her hand. "For everything." After Eleanor left, promising to check in tomorrow, I wandered through the rooms of my home, reacquainting myself with each space. In my study, Patricia's folder sat prominently on the desk, alongside a small package wrapped in brown paper. A note from Eleanor was paperclipped to it. "A welcome home gift for your new beginning." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, similar to the one I'd kept in Edinburgh but more substantial. The first page bore an inscription in Eleanor's elegant handwriting: "To record the journey ahead, not the path behind." I placed it beside the legal folder, two symbols of my new reality. One represented protection from the past, the other, possibility for the future. As evening settled over Maple Ridge, I unpacked my suitcase and prepared a simple dinner. The house felt quieter than I remembered, each creak and settling noise more noticeable. I found myself double-checking the security panel more often than necessary, reassuring myself with its steady green light. Just as I was finishing my meal, the doorbell rang, sending my heart racing. Through the new security camera display in the kitchen, I could see a delivery person holding a large arrangement of flowers. After verifying his identity through the intercom system, I accepted the delivery cautiously. The card attached to the autumn bouquet read simply, "Welcome home. Your class awaits." The literature department. I smiled, touched by my colleague's thoughtfulness. The department chair had been supportively outraged when I'd explained my abbreviated version of events before leaving for Scotland. She'd immediately approved my proposal for the new course on elder narratives in literature, even expediting the curriculum review process so I could begin teaching it this semester. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with Edinburgh's winding streets suddenly transforming into unfamiliar labyrinths. I woke early, disoriented momentarily by the familiar surroundings of my bedroom after weeks abroad. A light rain tapped against the windows as I made coffee and settled at my desk. With Eleanor's journal, the blank pages invited reflection, not just about Victor and what had happened, but about what would come next. I began writing, not about the past, but about the woman I was becoming, the literature professor evolving into an advocate, the mother learning to exist separately from her maternal identity. Mid-morning brought a call from Patricia, checking in and updating me on a few final legal matters. "Victor and Denise have put their house on the market," she mentioned near the end of our conversation. "My sources tell me they're planning to move back to Boston." The news landed with surprising weight. Their departure would bring relief, certainly. No more chance encounters at the grocery store or community events. But it also felt like the final severing of possibility, the last acknowledgement that reconciliation was not on the horizon. "I see," I said simply, not trusting myself to say more. "Margaret," Patricia's voice softened. "This is good news. Physical distance will make your life easier." "I know," I agreed. "It's just—" I stopped, unable to articulate the complex emotions churning within me. "It makes it real," Patricia finished for me. "I understand." After our call, I found myself standing in the doorway of what had been Victor's childhood bedroom, long since converted to a guest room but still containing traces of his youth, debate trophies I couldn't bear to store away, a framed photograph, of father and son fishing at the lake cabin, a small collection of astronomy books that had sparked his early interest in science. I touched each item gently, acknowledging that these artifacts were now memorials to a relationship that existed, primarily in the past. The boy in these mementos was not the man who had schemed to control my assets, just as I was no longer simply the devoted mother willing to overlook increasingly troubling behavior. That afternoon, I drove to Burlington Community College for the first time since returning. The campus bustled with early fall activity, students lounging on the quad, faculty hurrying between buildings with coffee cups and scattered papers, the familiar academic rhythm that had structured most of my adult life. The literature department chair, Diane, greeted me with a warm hug. "Our prodigal professor returns," she said with genuine affection. "How was Scotland?" "Transformative," I replied honestly. "Thank you for the flowers. Least we could do." She guided me toward my office. "Your class roster is full, by the way." 25 students signed up within days of the announcement. Apparently, literature of resilience and renewal struck a chord. My office had been freshened in my absence, books reshelved, desk organized, a new plant by the window. On the bulletin board, someone had pinned articles and notes about the authors I planned to teach. This space, unlike my home, felt untainted by recent events, a professional realm where I was defined by my expertise and contributions rather than by family drama. "We've missed you," Diane said. Not just these past weeks, but the last few years when you scaled back your teaching load. The department needs your voice, Margaret. Her words warmed something that had grown cold within me. Here was a community that valued me for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide, not for assets I'd accumulated, but for my mind and experience. I'm ready to be more present, I told her. I think I've been hiding in some ways, playing it safe. Diane smiled knowingly. Well, your syllabus certainly suggests you're done playing it safe. When Diane Lessing and Doris May Lessing appear on the same reading list, you know someone's ready to challenge some assumptions about aging women in literature. My first class session felt like stepping onto a stage after years in the wings. 25 students, ranging from traditional undergraduates to silver-haired community members who'd registered through the college's senior audit program, filled the semicircular classroom, their expectant faces turned toward me as I distributed the syllabus. Literature of Resilience and Renewal, I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. This course examines how writers across different eras and cultures have portrayed late-life transformation, rebellion, and reclamation of identity. A hand rose immediately, belonging to a woman perhaps a decade younger than myself, her curly gray hair framing a face lined with experience. I'm Gloria, she introduced herself. I'm wondering what inspired this course focus. It's rather specific. The question hung in the air for a moment. I could feel curious eyes on me, wondering if I would offer the polite, professional answer or something more personal. A month ago, I might have deflected, kept my private struggles separate from my academic persona. But if this experience had taught me anything, it was the power of honest narrative. Personal experience, I admitted. Recently, I found myself unexpectedly confronting assumptions about aging, competence, and autonomy. Literature has always been where I turned to make sense of life's complexities. I didn't elaborate further, but something in my tone must have conveyed authenticity. Several students nodded in recognition. Now, I continued more briskly, let's begin with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and her protagonist's reflections on the invisibility and revelation of aging in post-war London society. The 2-hour session flew by with an energy I hadn't experienced in my teaching for years. Students engaged deeply with the text, drawing connections to contemporary issues around aging and gender. One young man, an English major I recognized from a previous semester, pointed out how Clarissa Dalloway's internal richness contrasted with society's flattened perception of her as merely a hostess. Exactly, I affirmed. And this dichotomy between inner complexity and external reduction is a theme we'll explore throughout the course. How society attempts to simplify the elder experience, while those living it often find it's the most intricate chapter of their lives. After class, several students lingered to ask questions or share personal connections to the material. Gloria, the older student who had asked about my inspiration, approached last. That bit about society's flattened perception hit home, she said. My son recently suggested I should sell my house and move into a retirement community. When I explained I still had active consulting work and a social life, he looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd forgotten I exist beyond my role as his mother. The parallel to my own situation was so striking I nearly flinched. And how did you respond? I asked carefully. Gloria smiled, a sharp, knowing expression. I reminded him that I helped draft environmental policy for 3 governors and still consult with the state legislature. Then I recommended he read Betty Friedan's The Fountain of Age. He hasn't brought it up since. We both laughed, and I felt an immediate kinship with this woman who had faced, in a milder form, what I had confronted with Victor. I'd love to hear more about your consulting work sometime, I said sincerely. Perhaps coffee after next week's class? I'd like that, she agreed. This simple social connection, professional, intellectual, based on shared experience rather than family obligation, felt significant. an intentional expansion of my world at a time when other relationships had contracted. Over. The following weeks, autumn deepened across Vermont, the brilliant foliage giving way to stark branches against increasingly leaden skies. My routine took on new dimensions. Teaching twice a week, volunteering at the legal aid clinic on Wednesdays, meeting with my writing group, a local version of what I'd found in Edinburgh, on Thursday evenings. Each activity represented a conscious choice to build connection and purpose beyond the void Victor's absence had created. The legal aid work proved particularly fulfilling. Working alongside a patient attorney named Michael, I helped seniors navigate the complexities of estate planning, powers of attorney, and healthcare directives. My personal experience made me especially attuned to signs of potential exploitation or coercion. "You have a sixth sense for spotting family dynamics," Michael commented after I gently steered a conversation with an elderly man whose daughter had accompanied him, dominating the discussion and dismissing his preferences. My subtle questions had revealed that his primary concern was protecting assets for his disabled grandson, something his daughter had repeatedly minimized. "Let's just say I've seen how these situations can unfold," I replied. My friendship with Gloria deepened through our weekly coffee meetings after class. A retired environmental policy expert who had raised 3 children as a single mother, she shared my passion for literature and my experience with late-life reinvention. "Have you heard anything from Victor?" she asked one crisp November morning. As we sat in the college cafe, steam rising from our mugs, I sighed, cupping my hands around the warm ceramic. Patricia informed me that he attempted to contest the trust again last month. Same arguments, same rejection by the court. He's back in Boston now, working for his old firm. "And how does that make you feel?" Gloria's direct question reflected her no-nonsense approach to emotional matters. "Relieved, mostly," I admitted. "But there's still this undercurrent of mourning, I suppose. Not just for what happened, but for what will never be. The grandchildren I'll never know. The retirement years I'd imagined with family gatherings and holiday traditions." Gloria nodded thoughtfully. "The phantom future. I went through something similar after my divorce, grieving not just the marriage that had failed, but the imagined decades ahead that suddenly vanished." "Exactly." I took a sip of coffee. "The hardest adjustment hasn't been the practical changes or even the legal battles. It's been reimagining the final chapters of my life without the central character I'd always included in the narrative. But you're writing new characters into the story," Gloria observed. "Your students, the seniors at the legal clinic, this friendship." She gestured between us. "Maybe the final chapters will be more interesting than the version you'd originally planned?" Her words stayed with me that evening as I prepared for my writing group. We met in a cozy room above the local bookstore. 6 women ranging from mid-50s to early 80s, each working on personal essays, memoirs, or fiction. I had been reading sections of what I now called my Edinburgh Journal each week, transformed into an essay collection tentatively titled 70 and Sovereign. Tonight's selection described my return home and the strange sensation of seeing my house transformed into a secure fortress. I read the final paragraphs aloud. "The cameras and sensors that now guard my home are visible reminders of betrayal, yet they also represent a profound choice to protect what is mine, to value my autonomy above the comfort of false peace. Each security feature maps the boundaries I should have drawn years earlier." When I finished reading, there was a moment of silence before the group leader, a retired psychology professor named Ruth, spoke. "There's something universal here, beneath the specific circumstances. Many women our age are just learning to establish boundaries after decades of accommodation." Another member, John, nodded vigorously. "I didn't have a son try to take my assets, but I did have a husband who assumed I'd spend my retirement years as his full-time caretaker while he pursued every hobby he'd postponed. The day I enrolled in art school instead was my own small revolution. Have you considered publishing these essays?" asked Miriam, the youngest of our group at 57. There's a hunger for authentic stories about women reinventing themselves. Later in life? The suggestion startled me. I'd been writing for personal processing, not public consumption. Yet the idea took root. Another way to transform painful experience into something meaningful, perhaps even helpful to others. I'll think about it, I promised. That night, alone in my secure home, I found myself drawn to the small box of Victor's childhood mementos I kept in my study closet. Among the school projects and hand-drawn cards was a Father's Day gift he'd made in 2nd grade, a paper tie decorated with crayon drawings of him and David fishing, carefully laminated by his teacher. At the bottom, in childish handwriting, "Since you teach me everything, Dad." I traced the letters gently, remembering how devastated 7-year-old Victor had been when David died just months after he'd given this gift. How desperately he had clung to me, his remaining parent. How determined I'd been to fill both parental roles, to ensure he never felt the absence too keenly. Had that determination, that overwhelming maternal compensation, somehow laid the groundwork for what would happen decades later? Had I taught him, unintentionally, to see me as a resource rather than a person in my own right? The question had no simple answer, but sitting with it felt important. Part of the ongoing work of understanding not just what had happened with Victor, but how I would carry that history forward. Not as a weight to bear, but as wisdom hard-won. Winter descended on Vermont with its characteristic intensity, transforming Maple Ridge into a snow globe landscape of white-capped roofs and ice-glazed trees. I found the stark beauty fitting, a visual representation of the clarity that had gradually replaced my initial shock and grief. 6 months had passed since Victor's attempted guardianship, 5 since the permanent restraining order, 4 since his return to Boston. The passage of time had not healed the wound so much as transformed it from an acute, stabbing pain to a steady, manageable ache, present but no longer debilitating. My life had taken on new rhythms. Teaching 3 days a week, volunteering at the legal clinic, meeting with my writing group, and frequent dinners with Gloria, who had become my closest friend. I'd even begun dating, tentatively, a retired history professor named James who shared my love of early American literature and jazz. "You seem lighter," Eleanor observed one evening as we shared dinner at her home. She'd invited me for what had become our monthly check-in, typically a blend of legal updates and personal connection. "Dway, I asked, accepting the glass of wine she offered. She nodded, less watchful. "When you first returned from Edinburgh, you checked your surroundings constantly, like someone who'd survived an earthquake and expected aftershocks at any moment." I considered her observation. "I think I've stopped waiting for the next attack. Whether it's acceptance or just exhaustion, I'm not sure. Progress either way," Eleanor said, raising her glass in a small toast. "Has there been any contact?" I knew she meant Victor. "Not directly. Patricia mentioned that his lawyer made some noise about negotiating visitation rights." I couldn't help the short, bitter laugh that escaped me. As if he were a non-custodial parent instead of a grown man legally prohibited from approaching his mother after attempting to have her declared incompetent. "That's a particularly tone-deaf approach," Eleanor agreed. "What did Patricia say?" "That any request would need to go through formal legal channels and demonstrate meaningful rehabilitation and acknowledgement of wrongdoing." I traced the rim of my wine glass. "We both know that's unlikely to happen." What I didn't say, what I hardly admitted even to myself, was that some tiny part of me still hoped for that impossible scenario. Some version of reconciliation where Victor genuinely recognized the harm he'd caused, where we could rebuild some form of relationship within carefully maintained boundaries. The rational part of me recognized this as wishful thinking, but decades of maternal love couldn't be entirely silenced by even the most egregious betrayal. Our conversation shifted to my writing project, which had evolved from personal essays into a book manuscript tentatively titled Late Bloomers Reclaiming Autonomy. In the third act, a small feminist press in Burlington had expressed interest after I'd published 2 essays in literary journals. It's therapeutic, I explained as we moved from the dining room to Eleanor's comfortable living room, settling into armchairs before the fireplace. Transforming personal trauma into something potentially useful for others. The best kind of alchemy, Eleanor agreed. Though I worry sometimes that you're processing everything a bit too tidily, turning messy emotions into polished prose before you've fully felt them. Her observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Perhaps, I conceded, but feeling everything at once seemed unbearable in the beginning. Parceling it out through writing made it manageable. Fair enough, Eleanor said. Just don't mistake articulation for resolution. They're not the same thing. I carried her words with me in the weeks that followed, particularly during the holiday season, my first without any family connections. Thanksgiving had been a communal affair at Gloria's house, with several colleagues and their spouses creating a warm, if unconventional, gathering. But as Christmas approached, the absence of family traditions felt increasingly stark. My writing group had planned a winter solstice celebration, and James had invited me to join him for a Christmas Eve concert at the college. I'd decorated my home modestly, more from habit than enthusiasm, and arranged to volunteer at a community dinner on Christmas Day. Externally, I'd filled the holiday calendar with meaningful alternatives. Internally, I still struggled with the echoes of Christmas past. A week before Christmas, I was leaving the campus parking lot after my final class of the semester when my phone rang. The display showed an unfamiliar Boston number. I answered cautiously, using the car's Bluetooth system. Professor Sullivan? A woman's voice, professional but warm. This is Dr. Rebecca Thorne from Boston University Medical Center. I'm calling. About your son, Victor Sullivan. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Is he hurt? He's stable, she assured me quickly. But he has been admitted to our cardiac unit following what appears to be a mild heart attack. We found your contact information in his wallet. A heart attack. Victor was only 46, the same age his father had been when he died of similar causes. The parallel sent ice through my veins. I understand there may be complex circumstances. Dr. Thorne continued carefully. But he's been asking for you, and I felt obligated to call. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, suddenly unable to focus on driving. There's a restraining order, I explained, my voice distant to my own ears. I'm legally prohibited from contact with him. I see. A pause. Well, I should inform you that his condition, while not immediately life-threatening, is serious. There appears to be significant coronary artery disease that will likely require surgical intervention, like his father. The thought repeated in my mind like a skipping record, just like his father. Professor Sullivan, are you still there? Yes, I managed. Thank you for letting me know. I'll need to consult with my attorney about what's legally permissible. After disconnecting, I sat motionless in my car, watching shoppers hurry through the light snow with Christmas purchases. The rational part of my mind was already cataloging the necessary steps, calling Patricia, discussing options, perhaps having Eleanor serve as an intermediary for medical information. But beneath that practical assessment, emotions churned violently. Fear for Victor's health, anger that even this situation felt complicated by his past actions, grief for the simple maternal response I couldn't freely offer. My phone rang again. Gloria, calling about our planned dinner. I let it go to voicemail, unable to engage in normal conversation. Instead, I dialed Patricia's number. My son has had a heart attack, I said when she answered, the words strange in my mouth. I need to know what my legal options are. Patricia's response was immediate and practical. Where is he hospitalized? Has he requested contact directly or through his doctors? Do you want me to reach out to his attorney? Each question helped anchor me in the logistics rather than the overwhelming emotions. By the time we ended the call 20 minutes later, we had a plan. Patricia would contact Victor's lawyer to establish whether he genuinely wanted to see me. If so, she would apply for a temporary exception to the restraining order for medical purposes only. Eleanor would serve as an intermediary and potential accompanying person if I decided to visit. The decision is entirely yours, Patricia emphasized before we hung up. A medical emergency doesn't erase what happened. You're not obligated to respond. I knew she was right, but the situation wasn't so straightforward for me. Despite everything, the thought of Victor facing his father's disease alone seemed unbearable. David had died before modern cardiac interventions were routine, leaving 7-year-old Victor with a primal fear of heart disease that had shadowed him into adulthood. At home, I moved through my evening routine mechanically, feeding my cat, preparing a simple dinner, checking the security system. But my mind remained in that Boston hospital room, imagining Victor grappling with the same diagnosis that had taken his father. I opened my laptop and began writing, not polished prose, for my manuscript, but raw, unfiltered thoughts addressed directly to Victor. The letter I would never send, expressing the tangled mess of emotions his health crisis had triggered, concern for his well-being, anger at being put in this position, painful memories of his father's death, fear that genetic predisposition might claim another Sullivan before their time. When I finally closed the laptop hours later, exhaustion had replaced the initial shock. Whatever decisions lay ahead would require clearer thinking than I could manage tonight. I fell into bed fully dressed, slipping into troubled dreams where I moved through hospital corridors that never led to Victor's room, while David's voice called out directions I couldn't quite hear. The next morning brought an email from Patricia. Victor's lawyer had confirmed his request to see me. A judge had granted a limited exception to the restraining order strictly for hospital visits accompanied by a third party. Eleanor had volunteered to drive me to Boston whenever I decided, if I decided. The ball was in my court now. I stood at my living room window, watching early morning light transform the snow-covered landscape from blue-gray to sparkling white. The beauty of Vermont winters had always reminded me of life's capacity for renewal. Barren, branches and buried earth eventually yielding to spring's persistence. But some relationships, once broken, remained so. Some betrayals cut too deep for complete healing. Could Victor's health crisis offer a different path forward? Or would it simply create another opportunity for disappointment and manipulation? I had no way of knowing. All I could do was decide whether the possibility of genuine reconciliation, however slim, was worth the risk of further hurt. The drive to Boston unfolded in relative silence. Eleanor, true to her word, had picked me up at 7 that morning, a thermos of coffee and a bag of freshly baked scones waiting in her car. We'd exchanged few words beyond logistics, the weather forecast, expected travel time, which hospital entrance would be closest to the cardiac unit. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor said as we crossed the Massachusetts border. It was the first direct acknowledgement of our purpose since we'd left Vermont. I know. I watched the winter landscape blur past my window. But I think I have to know, one way or another. Know what? If there's anything real left, I replied. Or if this is just another manipulation. Eleanor nodded, her eyes steady on the highway. I'll be right there with you. One word, one gesture that feels wrong, and we leave. Agreed? Agreed. Boston University Medical Center rose before us like a fortress of glass and steel. Its modern architecture at odds with the historic buildings surrounding it. As we navigated the parking garage and followed signs to the cardiac unit, I felt an increasing sense of unreality, as if I were watching myself move through these sterile corridors from some distant vantage point. At the nurse's station, I gave my name with a steady voice that belied my internal trembling. "I'm here to see Victor Sullivan. I'm his mother. The nurse's expression shifted subtly. Recognition, perhaps, of a situation more complex than the usual family visit. Dr. Thorne asked to speak with you before you go in, she said, reaching for the phone. If you could wait in the consultation. Room just down the hall? Dr. Thorne proved to be younger than I'd expected, perhaps mid-40s, with prematurely silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She greeted me with a firm handshake, acknowledging Eleanor with a nod when I introduced her as my legal representative. Before you see your son, I want to be clear about his condition, she began, gesturing for us to sit in the small, windowless consultation room. Victor experienced what we call a NSTEMI, a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. Essentially, a heart attack caused by partial blockage of the coronary arteries. Like his father, I murmured. Dr. Thorne nodded. Yes, he mentioned the family history. We've conducted an angiogram that shows significant coronary artery disease, particularly in the left anterior descending artery, what we sometimes call the widowmaker, because blockages there can be particularly dangerous. What's the treatment plan? Eleanor asked when I remained silent, processing this information. We're recommending bypass surgery, scheduled for tomorrow morning. Dr. Thorne's gaze returned to me. The prognosis is good with intervention, but this is serious. The genetic component combined with what appears to be significant ongoing stress creates a concerning picture. Is he aware of all this? I asked. Fully. Dr. Thorne hesitated. He's frightened, Mrs. Sullivan. He's been asking for you repeatedly, which is why I took the liberty of calling despite being made aware of the complicated situation between you. I nodded, appreciating her directness. Has his wife been here? Something flickered across Dr. Thorne's expression. I understand they're separated. She visited briefly yesterday but hasn't returned. Separated. The information landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of questions through my mind. When? Why? How had I not known? Before I take you to his room, Dr. Thorne continued, I should mention that he's been quite emotional, which isn't uncommon after a cardiac event. Many patients experience what we call cardiac blues, a heightened emotional state that can include depression, anxiety, even personality changes. You're suggesting I shouldn't take anything he says too much to heart? I asked, the inadvertent pun hanging awkwardly between us. Dr. Thorne smiled gently. I'm suggesting that a medical crisis often brings clarity about what matters, but the expression of that clarity can be raw and unfiltered, for better or worse. With that warning, she led us through double doors into the cardiac unit. Each room we passed contained its own private drama, patients surrounded by machines and monitors, family members maintaining bedside vigils, the hushed conversations of those confronting mortality in its most immediate form. Room 418 was no different, except that the patient inside was my son. Victor looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital linens. Monitors tracked his vital signs in steady electronic rhythms, and an IV line snaked from his arm to a hanging bag of clear fluid. His face, always lean, appeared gaunt, with shadowed eyes that widened when he saw me in the doorway. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. You came. I moved to the side of his bed, Eleanor positioning herself discreetly near the door, present but giving us what privacy the situation allowed. Dr. Thorne called me, I said, uncertain what else to offer. Victor's eyes filled with tears. I didn't think you would come. After everything. I wasn't sure I would either, I admitted. The frank admission seemed to surprise him. Good. We were beyond platitudes. They say I need surgery. His voice held the same fear I remembered from when he was 7, learning his father wouldn't be coming home from the hospital. The same thing that killed Dad. Not the same, I corrected gently. They can fix this now. Medicine has advanced considerably in 40 years. Victor nodded, though the fear remained etched in his expression. After a moment's hesitation, I took the chair beside his bed, maintaining the delicate balance between proximity and distance that our situation demanded. Dr. Thorne mentioned you and Denise are separated, I said, deciding directness was the only possible approach. 6 months ago. He looked away. Right after everything? So their marriage had fallen apart in the aftermath of the failed guardianship attempt. I wasn't surprised exactly, but the confirmation brought a complex wave of emotions, vindication tinged with sadness for what might have been a family now doubly fractured. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. Whatever Denise's part in their scheme, the dissolution of a 12-year marriage represented real loss. Victor's laugh held no humor. You're sorry? After what we tried to do to you? I can be sorry for your pain without excusing its cause. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the steady beep of his heart monitor. I've been thinking about you every day since you disappeared, he finally said. About what I did. I waited, unwilling to make this easier for him. I was drowning, he continued, his voice low. The Boston position ended badly. Investments went wrong. Denise's spending. We were underwater financially, and I panicked. So, you decided to take my assets, I said, keeping my voice neutral with effort. To have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. He flinched visibly at the blunt assessment. It sounds terrible when you say it like that. It was terrible. Victor, how else should I say it? His gaze finally met mine, tears spilling onto his hollow cheeks. I don't have any defense. I thought I was entitled to your assets. I convinced myself you wouldn't really mind giving up your independence if it meant helping me. That the end justified the means. The raw honesty was startling after months of legal evasions and manipulations. Was this the cardiac blues Dr. Thorne had mentioned, or something more genuine? Why tell me this now? I asked. Because you're facing mortality like your father did? Victor's hand moved toward mine on the bed rail, then stopped, remembering perhaps that he had no right to such familiar comfort. Partly. Lying in the emergency room, I was certain I was dying. All I could think was that I'd die with you hating me, and deservedly so. I don't hate you, Victor. The admission cost me something to voice. I'm angry, I'm hurt, I'm disappointed beyond words, but hatred requires an ongoing investment of emotion that I haven't been willing to make. He nodded slowly. When I wake up tomorrow, if I wake up. You will, I interrupted firmly. When I wake up, he amended. I want to try to make amends, not for forgiveness. I don't expect that. But because it's right. I studied his face, searching for signs of the calculation I'd grown to recognize in our last interactions. All I saw was fear and regret, emotions too primal to easily fabricate. I'll be here when you wake up, I said finally. We can talk, more than. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. As I stood to leave, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw the book, your essays, Sovereign at 70. Denise found it online and showed me, thinking it would make me angry. But I read it all. His voice caught. I never understood before how complete you were without me. How I was just part of your life, not the center of it. The revelation that he'd read my published essays, personal explorations of autonomy and identity past 70, caught me off guard. Those pieces had been written as part of my healing, never imagining he would see them. That's part of growing. Up, Victor, I said after a moment. Realizing your parents are full human beings beyond their relationship to you. I'm 46, he said with a ghost of a smile. A bit late for that particular lesson. At the door, I turned back for one last look. Some lessons find us when we need them most, not when they're most convenient. Outside in the corridor, Eleanor touched my arm gently. You okay? I'm not sure, I answered honestly. That was not what I expected. What did you expect? Manipulation, calculated emotional appeal, more of the same. I shook my head. This seemed genuine, Eleanor suggested. Maybe. Or maybe just the raw fear of a man facing his father's fate. We made our way back through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage. Eleanor had offered to get a hotel room so I could stay for Victor's surgery the next day, and I'd accepted gratefully. Do you think people truly change? I asked as we reached her car. Or do they just become more essentially themselves under pressure? Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Both, sometimes. Crisis burns away pretense. What remains might be their truest self, for better or worse. And Victor's truest self? Only time will tell, she said wisely. But you don't have to decide today what role he'll play in your life going forward. You only needed to decide whether to be here now. I nodded, watching the winter sun sink behind. Boston's skyline. Tomorrow would bring Victor's surgery, a medical intervention to repair his damaged heart. Whether there could be any similar repair to our relationship remained an open question, one that neither of us could answer in a single hospital conversation. For now, it was enough that I had come, that I had spoken my truth, and that I had listened to his. Small steps on uncertain ground, but steps nonetheless. Spring came slowly to Vermont that year. Reluctant buds appeared on the maple trees outside my window, and crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow in my garden. Nature's annual reminder that renewal follows even the harshest seasons. 3 months had passed since Victor's surgery. The quadruple bypass had been successful, though his recovery had been slower than expected. Complications with infection had extended his hospital stay to nearly 2 weeks. I'd remained in Boston for the duration, settling into a strange routine of morning visits, afternoon breaks at a nearby coffee shop to work on my manuscript, and evening check-ins before returning to my hotel. Eleanor had stayed the first 3 days, then returned to Vermont, satisfied that Victor's medical crisis was genuine and his expressions of remorse consistent. Call me if anything changes, she'd said, either medically or emotionally. But nothing had changed, at least not in alarming ways. Each day, Victor and I had cautiously rebuilt something that wasn't quite our former relationship but wasn't quite nothing either. Conversations that started with safe topics, his treatment plan, my writing progress, neutral memories from his childhood, gradually expanded to include more difficult territory. I've been seeing a therapist since the separation, he'd shared one afternoon during his second week in the hospital. Initially because Denise insisted as part of our divorce negotiations. But I've continued because I needed to understand how I became someone who could do what I did. And have you found answers? I'd asked, genuinely curious. Some. He'd looked out the window rather than at me. I've had to confront some ugly truths about entitlement, about seeing you as an extension of myself rather than as your own person, about equating financial support with love. These conversations, halting and sometimes painful, had continued after his discharge, when he'd moved temporarily into a small apartment near the hospital for his outpatient rehabilitation. I'd returned to Vermont but made weekly trips to Boston, each visit another careful step on uncertain ground. Now, as April warmed into May, I stood in my garden cutting early spring flowers for the dining room table. The upcoming evening felt significant. Victor was visiting Vermont for the first time since his surgery, since the restraining order had been conditionally modified to allow supervised contact. The doorbell rang precisely at 6. Through the security camera, I could see Victor standing on my porch, looking more like himself than he had in the hospital, but still carrying the physical markers of his health crisis. Thinner, slightly stooped, movements more careful than before. I opened the door, noting how he automatically stepped back to maintain a respectful distance. "Welcome," I said, ushering him inside. "Thank you for having me." He handed me a small gift bag. Just a token of appreciation. Inside was a book, a first edition of Mary Oliver's New and Selected Poems, a poet I'd often quoted during his childhood. The inscription read simply, "For new beginnings, with gratitude, Victor." "It's lovely," I said honestly, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Let me show you what I've done with the garden this spring." We settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new, touring the garden where spring plantings were just emerging, sharing a simple dinner I'd prepared, discussing his cardiac rehabilitation progress and the article I was writing for a literary journal about aging in contemporary fiction. The conversation flowed more easily than I'd expected, absent of the old tensions but also devoid of false intimacy. We were two adults navigating a complex history, neither pretending the past hadn't happened nor allowing it to entirely dictate the present. After dinner, Victor helped clear the table, movements careful around my space, asking permission before opening cabinets or drawers. As we settled in the living room with tea, he finally broached the topic we'd been circling. "I met with Patricia last week," he said, "about formally acknowledging what happened and making legal amends." I nodded, having already heard from Patricia about their meeting. "She mentioned you'd proposed a settlement." "Not a settlement," he corrected gently. "A restitution. For the legal fees you incurred defending yourself against me. For the security systems you needed to install. For the emotional distress I caused." He paused. "It's not about money, though the money matters. It's about formally acknowledging the harm done. And having it in writing that you waive any future claims to my assets or decisions," I added, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "Yes," he acknowledged. "You need that protection, and I need to provide it." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our history settling between us like a physical presence. "Denise has moved to California," Victor said eventually. "The divorce was finalized last month." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. He shook his head. "Don't be. It needed to end. We brought out the worst in each other." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "My therapist would say we activated each other's maladaptive patterns. And what would you say? That we were bad for each other. That, together, we convinced ourselves that entitlement was ambition and that exploitation was just being smart." He set down his teacup. "I'm not blaming her for what I did to you. That was my choice. But I'm learning to recognize the dynamics that enabled my worst decisions." I studied my son's face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the threads of gray at his temples that hadn't been there before his heart attack. He looked older, certainly, but also somehow more substantial, less the sleek financial professional, and more a human being grappling with difficult truths. "What comes next for you?" I asked. "After your recovery?" "I've been offered a position teaching finance at a community college in Concord," he said. "Nothing prestigious, but stable. A chance to use what I know to actually help people understand money rather than manipulate it." The revelation surprised me. Teaching had never seemed aligned with Victor's ambitions or temperament. "That's quite a change of direction." "That's rather the point," he said wryly. "The old direction led me to nearly lose everything that matters, including you." I didn't respond immediately, aware that we were approaching emotional territory that still felt precarious. Victor seemed to sense my hesitation. "I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were," he clarified. "I know that's not possible. I just want a chance to build something new, something better." "With boundaries," I said. "With boundaries," he agreed firmly. "Clear ones, respected ones." As the evening drew to a close, we walked together to the front door. The security system's control panel glowed softly in the entryway, a reminder of what had been necessary, what might still be necessary in some form. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," I said as Victor prepared to leave. "Not as an event, but as a process, something that unfolds alongside accountability, not instead of it." "I'd like that chance," he said quietly. "To be held accountable while working toward forgiveness, however long it takes." After he left, I stood for a moment on my porch, watching spring stars emerge in the darkening Vermont sky. The future remained uncertain. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily or completely. But standing there, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again in relation to my son. Possibility. 1 year later, I stood before a packed auditorium at Burlington Community College, adjusting the microphone as I prepared to introduce our symposium. Autonomy and Aging, Rewriting the Narrative. The event marked the culmination of a project that had grown from my personal experience into something far larger, a multidisciplinary exploration of elder rights, financial independence, and identity beyond traditional family roles. Scanning the audience, I noted familiar faces, my writing, group members seated together near the front, Eleanor and Patricia in the second row, Gloria and her new partner beside them. And in the back, arriving just as the lights dimmed, Victor, now teaching full-time in Concord and driving up monthly for our carefully structured visits. "Good evening," I began. When I turned 70, I expected to settle into a quiet retirement surrounded by books and memories. Instead, I found myself on the front lines of a battle for my own autonomy, a battle that countless older adults face each year, often silently and without the resources to fight back. As I continued my remarks, I felt the weight of the past. 18 months, the betrayal, the legal struggles, the painful reconstruction of boundaries and expectations. But I also felt the surprising strength that had emerged from that crucible, the newfound purpose that had transformed personal trauma into advocacy. The path forward with Victor remained complicated. Trust rebuilt in small increments, genuine contrition, meeting cautious acceptance. Our relationship would never be what it had been, nor what either of us had once imagined it could be. Instead, it was evolving into something entirely new, more conscious of its limitations, more intentional in its connections, governed by clear boundaries and mutual respect. After the symposium, our small group gathered at a local restaurant, friends, colleagues, and family in its complex, reconstructed form. As conversations flowed around me, I found myself observing rather than participating, struck by the tableau before me. This unlikely community that had formed in the aftermath of crisis. "A penny for your thoughts," Gloria said, sliding into the chair beside me with a glass of wine. "I was just thinking about reconstruction," I replied. "Not just rebuilding what was lost, but building something different, sometimes better." "Like your relationship with Victor?" I glanced across the table where he was engaged in conversation with Eleanor about elder law reform, a subject he'd become increasingly knowledgeable about over the past year. "Yes, and like my sense of self, my understanding of family, my purpose." Gloria nodded, understanding in her eyes. "From victim to advocate, it's a powerful transformation. Not just advocate," I corrected gently. "Person. Complete in myself, whether or not reconciliation had been possible with Victor. That was the most important lesson, that my worth and identity weren't contingent on maintaining traditional family structures or roles." Later that evening, as the gathering dispersed into the soft spring night, Victor approached me with the careful respect that now characterized our interactions. "Your speech was powerful," he said. "You've created something meaningful from what happened." "We create meaning where we can," I replied. "It's the only way forward sometimes." He nodded, understanding the layers in my response. "I'll see you next month? For the garden planting?" "Yes," I confirmed. Though I should warn you, I've expanded the vegetable beds considerably. There will be much more digging than last year. I'm getting stronger, he said simply. I can handle it. As he walked toward his car, I was struck by how that simple exchange encapsulated our new reality, acknowledging what had changed, accepting limitations, but moving forward nonetheless. Not with blind trust or unconditional acceptance, but with open eyes and deliberate choices. At 71, I had learned that life's later chapters often unfold in unexpected ways, that relationships can fracture and partially heal, leaving visible seams where the breaks occurred. That autonomy means claiming the right to determine not just how one lives, but how one loves, with appropriate boundaries, with clear-eyed assessment of risks and rewards. Most importantly, I had learned that sovereignty wasn't just about legal protections or financial independence, though those matters remained vitally important. True sovereignty resided in the knowledge that my worth wasn't diminished by betrayal, that my identity wasn't defined by maternal obligation, and that my future wasn't constrained by others' expectations. Standing in my garden the next morning, I noticed the daylilies returning, the same ones Victor and I had planted decades ago. They would bloom this summer as they had every summer, orange and abundant, neither erasing the difficult seasons that had passed nor being defined by them, simply persisting, gathering strength underground, and emerging again with each new chance at renewal. I knelt in the soft spring soil and began preparing the ground for what would come next. 3 years had passed since Victor's heart attack had unexpectedly altered the course of our estrangement. At 73, I found myself in places I had never imagined during those dark days following his guardianship attempt, standing at a podium in the Vermont State House, testifying before the legislature on a bill I had helped draft. Senate. Bill 247, the Elder Financial Autonomy and Protection Act, addresses critical gaps in our current laws. I explained to the assembled lawmakers, my voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. As someone who narrowly escaped financial exploitation through extensive legal resources and fortunate timing, I recognize that most seniors lack such advantages. The room was silent as I recounted an abbreviated version of my experience: the systematic manipulation, the falsified medical evaluation, the attempted asset seizure. I no longer felt the sharp sting of humiliation that had once accompanied these revelations. Time and purpose had transformed personal trauma into professional testimony. This legislation would require stringent documentation for guardianship proceedings, mandate independent medical evaluations by multiple practitioners, and create a rapid response legal team for seniors facing potential exploitation, I continued. Most importantly, it would establish a presumption of competence for older adults that must be definitively disproven, rather than placing the burden on seniors to prove their capabilities. From the corner of my eye, I could see Patricia nodding approvingly from the gallery. Beside her sat Eleanor, now 81 but still sharp as ever, and Gloria, who had become not just a friend but a partner in advocacy. And at the end of the row, somewhat apart but undeniably present, was Victor. His attendance had surprised me. Our carefully reconstructed relationship now included monthly dinners, occasional gardening sessions, and brief holiday gatherings. But he had never before witnessed my advocacy work directly. This legislative hearing represented the culmination of efforts that had begun with my personal journal entries and evolved into a statewide coalition of elder rights organizations, legal experts, and medical professionals. After my testimony, during the brief recess, Victor approached cautiously, still maintaining the respectful distance that characterized our interactions. "That was powerful," he said simply. "Seeing the wider impact, it's different from hearing about it." I studied his face, noting the healthy color that had returned over the years of cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle changes. At 49, he looked stronger than he had before his heart attack, though permanent lines of strain had settled around his eyes. "Why did you come today?" I asked directly. He considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had developed during his years of therapy. I wanted to witness what you've built from what I tried to destroy, he finally said. To fully understand the consequences, both negative and eventually positive, of what I did. The frank acknowledgement still caught me off guard sometimes, despite the years of careful reconciliation work. There was no evasion in Victor now, no charming deflection or manipulation. Whether this represented genuine transformation or simply better boundaries remained an open question, one that I had learned to live with. The committee chair thinks it will pass, I told him, shifting back to the legislation. With amendments, certainly, but the core protections should remain intact. You should be proud, he said. How many lives will this legislation touch? Approximately 30,000 Vermont seniors annually, according to our research, I replied. But the model legislation could potentially spread to other states if successful. Our conversation was interrupted by Patricia, approaching with a state senator who had questions about implementation. Victor nodded farewell and returned to his seat, understanding the boundaries of our interaction in this professional context. Later that evening, I hosted a small gathering at my home for the coalition members who had worked on the legislation. The house that had once been fortified against intrusion now regularly welcomed visitors, friends, colleagues, and advocacy partners who filled the rooms with purpose and connection. To Margaret, Patricia toasted, raising her glass as the group gathered in my living room, who transformed personal adversity into statewide change. Murmurs of agreement and the gentle clinking of glasses followed, warming me more than the spring evening required. Gloria squeezed my hand in silent support. After the guests departed, I found myself in the garden, drawn to the quiet beauty of twilight settling over my carefully tended plants. The security light still activated with motion at the property's perimeter, a permanent reminder of necessary vigilance, but no longer dominated my consciousness. The sound of footsteps on the garden path alerted me to Victor's approach. He had stayed behind, helping clear glasses and tidy the kitchen with the careful assistance that had become his way of making small amends. I thought I might find you out here, he said, stopping at a respectful distance. Just admiring the evening, I replied. The legislation was only part of today's good news. My publisher called earlier. They want to release Sovereign in a new edition with additional essays and a study guide for senior centers and community groups. Congratulations, Victor said sincerely. The book has already helped so many people recognize the warning signs I displayed. There it was again, that direct acknowledgement of his role in the story, neither minimized nor dramatized. 3 years of therapy and accountability had given him a vocabulary for his actions that neither sought cheap forgiveness nor wallowed in performative shame. I've been offered a position at Boston University, he said after a moment. Teaching ethics in finance, ironically enough. I'd be starting in the fall semester. That's a significant opportunity, I observed, noting the implications. You'd be moving back to Boston permanently? Yes, he confirmed. I've been deliberating about whether to accept, considering our monthly visits. The careful consideration of how his decisions might affect our fragile relationship was relatively new, a development of the past year or so. Earlier in his recovery, Victor had still demonstrated flashes of the self-centered decision-making that had characterized much of his adult life. You should take it, I said firmly. We can adjust our schedule. Perhaps fewer visits but longer ones when they occur. He nodded, relief evident in his expression. Thank you. I wanted to be certain it wouldn't disrupt the progress we've made. Progress. Such a neutral word for the complex journey we had undertaken. The careful reconstruction of trust within firm boundaries, the gradual relaxation of some vigilances while maintaining others. We would never return to conventional mother-son dynamics. That possibility had died the day he slid guardianship papers across my birthday cake. But we had built something else. A relationship between adults with clear expectations, mutual respect, and no illusions. I've been thinking about transitions lately, I said, turning to look at the garden rather than at him. Life seems to be composed of them, particularly in later years. What transitions are you considering? Victor asked carefully. Gloria has asked me to consider sharing a home, I said, the words feeling strange to speak aloud. Not immediately, but eventually. Her house is larger, with a separate apartment that would allow for both privacy and companionship. I hadn't planned to share this development with Victor yet, but the day's events, his attendance at the hearing, the legislative progress, his job news, had created a moment of unusual openness between us. That sounds... He paused, visibly, processing the information. Actually, that sounds like a thoughtful arrangement. You're considering it seriously? I am, I acknowledged. At 73, I'm cognizant of the statistics regarding isolated living. And beyond practical considerations, I enjoy her company immensely. You've become quite close, Victor observed neutrally. We have, I confirmed, not elaborating further. The nature of my relationship with Gloria, deeper than friendship, not quite romantic but beyond conventional categorization, was still evolving, still being defined by the two of us without external labels. Would you sell this house? The question revealed his continuing awareness of the property's financial value, though not in the predatory way of years past. Eventually, perhaps, but not immediately. I'd likely rent it initially, preserving the option to return. I looked around at the gardens I'd tended for decades. Some transitions need to be gradual. Victor nodded, understanding evident in his expression. Like our own. Precisely. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching fireflies begin their evening display among the garden beds. The relationship between us now was unlike anything I could have imagined 3 years ago, neither fully repaired nor permanently severed, but intentionally redesigned. A new structure built atop the foundation of what remained after the destruction. I should go, Victor said eventually. It's getting late, and you've had a momentous day. As we walked toward the front of the house, I found myself reflecting on identity, how mine had expanded so dramatically in the years since Victor's betrayal had forced me to reconsider everything. Teacher, writer, advocate, friend, potential companion to Gloria, roles that had either emerged or deepened through crisis. I've been invited to speak at a conference in Edinburgh next spring, I mentioned as Victor prepared to leave. A full circle moment, returning to where I began processing everything. You should go, he encouraged. Revisit Moira's bookshop. The fact that he remembered this detail from our carefully shared conversations, my friendship with the Scottish bookseller who had offered such clarity during my initial escape, suggested how attentively he had listened during our graduated reconciliation. After Victor departed, I returned to my study where the day's mail awaited attention. Among the envelopes was one bearing the Vermont Bar Association logo. Inside was a formal notification that I had been named the recipient of their Citizen Advocate of the Year award, recognizing my work on elder financial protection legislation. Placed the letter beside a framed copy of my book cover and a photograph of our coalition members on the steps of the State House. 3 years ago, these tangible symbols of my advocacy would have seemed inconceivable, mere fantasies of purpose, emerging from betrayal. Now they represented not just what I had survived, but what I had built from that survival. Later that evening, I spoke with Gloria by phone, recounting the day's events and Victor's unexpected attendance at the hearing. How did that feel? She asked with her characteristic directness. Having him witness that part of your life? I considered the question carefully. Appropriate somehow. Not because I needed his validation, but because it completed a circle. The person who tried to dismiss my competence witnessed a room full of legislators seeking my expertise. Poetic justice, Gloria observed, though I suspect your emotions were more complex than satisfaction. They always are where Victor is concerned, I acknowledged. There's a perpetual duality, the son I raised and the man who betrayed me, existing simultaneously in the same person. And you've learned to hold both realities, she said, without denying either. Her understanding was one of the many gifts our relationship had brought into my life, the capacity to recognize complexity without demanding resolution, to acknowledge pain without being defined by it. At our ages, we had both learned that life rarely offers clean endings or perfect closures. As midnight approached, I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the Vermont night. The security lights created pools of illumination around my property, necessary protections still in place despite the years of healing. Some precautions, once implemented, become permanent features of the landscape. Not because the threat remains active, but because wisdom, once acquired, cannot be unlearned. Tomorrow would bring another legislative session, another chapter in my book revision, another day of carefully tended relationships and meaningful work. The past had not disappeared. Its lessons remained etched in legal documents, security systems, and careful boundaries, but it no longer dictated the future. At 73, I had discovered that sovereignty wasn't just about legal protection or financial independence. It was about authoring my own ongoing story, determining which relationships deserved renovation and which were better commemorated than continued. It was about recognizing that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that purpose could emerge from pain, and that identity continued evolving long after conventional narratives suggested it should be fixed. As I prepared for sleep, I reflected on how thoroughly Victor's betrayal had unknowingly launched me into the most self-determined chapter of my life, a period defined not by reaction to loss, but by intentional creation of something entirely new. The irony was not lost on me, though I had long since moved beyond bitterness into a more complex appreciation of how destruction sometimes clears ground for unexpected growth. The journey ahead still held questions. The potential home sharing. With Gloria, Victor's return to Boston, the expanding reach of my advocacy work, but they were questions I now approached with confidence rather than trepidation, knowing my capacity for adaptation had been tested and proven repeatedly. Whatever transitions awaited, I would face them not as threats to stability, but as invitations to further growth, opportunities to continue redefining what it meant to age with purpose, autonomy, and an ever-expanding sense of possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.